Hello and welcome to this video update for the second week of the Jane Austen MOOC. I'm Alison.
And I'm Amy.
And we're going to be doing a roundup of your comments and hopefully providing a little bit of in-depth analysis that you'll find interesting on the main topics that have been talked about this week. I'd like to start though by welcoming any newcomers that we've got to the course. We know that people are joining all the time, and if you haven't yet had a chance to, please feel free to go back and have a look at the work that's available for week 1 as well as week 2. And I'm sure Amy will agree that we've got a lot of exciting content coming up next week for week 3 as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So today we wanted to talk about obviously the main themes that have been covered this week. So this week 2's topics have mainly been about the influences and inspiration of Austen, but also about how she's presented through biographies. So we wanted to talk about the marriage market. So there's been a few articles on that and a lot of really interesting comments. Biography, again, is like a big section of how Austen's presented. And Shakespeare in the theatre as sort of more inspirations on Austen's work.
Yes, that's been quite a big thread over the past couple of weeks, and really we want to make people aware that the door's open, and if you've got any more ideas about Shakespeare and his influence on Austen, then do let us know and join the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the first thing that we're going to talk about is the marriage market and finances in general. And one of the things that I've found quite interesting about the course at the moment is Mrs. Bennet. Now, Mrs. Bennet has popped up in the comments, and what I would like to do is perhaps recalibrate the impressions that people have got about Mrs. Bennet. She's portrayed, certainly in the drama series that we've had on the television and in films recently, as being, slightly hysterical
and quite ridiculous.
Quite ridiculous, yes. The Alison Steadman interpretation is the classic example of this, where I would like to offer the alternative view that actually Mrs. Bennet is the financial brains of the outfit, and that it is Mr. Bennet who is perhaps being negligent towards his daughters by his attitude to the finances, in that he lives up to his income. There have been no savings made, and that at any moment some accident might befall him, and all the Bennet girls would have to live on would be the money that Mrs. Bennet originally brought to the marriage, which isn't very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously very heightened by how many daughters there are in the family, so there's so little to go around.
Yes, and the fact that Mr. Collins, with Charlotte Lucas in tow, will move into Longbourn and evict the girls. So this really opens the discussion onto how finances operated as far as women were concerned during the 18th century and the early 19th century. And I know there's certainly been a lot of comments on the list of marriageable women that we've put up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people have been quite surprised actually at how much the marriage market functioned as a market, and that these kind of publications like A Master Key actually did exist, that list women in a very categorical way. They're very, very blunt about them. It is like listing a item on the market.
Yes, I've likened it to the share listings in newspapers, and I think you were saying on another occasion, Amy, that these sums of money and the sums of money that were associated with particular women were part of newspaper publications as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of other publications in addition to A Master Key. But yes, there's very much in newspapers at the time and throughout the 18th century, you get a lot of sort of rumour associated with sort of female dowry and how much different women are worth. And this actually functioned very much as a sort of advertisement for the women and was very beneficial for them. So one of the women in particular that always strikes me is Seymour Worsley, who's been covered very extensively by Hallie Rubenhold in a biography. And Seymour Worsley was worth £50,000, but in the newspapers she was rumoured to be worth anywhere between £70,000 to even £100,000. And they very much encouraged these rumours because it made her more accessible to a very attractive suitor, which is definitely something they wanted to encourage. And in the end, she made a very profitable match.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things as well about the key that we were discussing before we came on camera was the issue of the widows, and that there are a lot of widows listed. But I think it's really important to point out, because this hasn't been made out on the course, that proportionately speaking, the number of widows who remarried during the 18th century was a lot lower than during previous centuries, certainly during the medieval period. And one of the reasons for this was possibly that widows had less control over their finances than widows in previous generations. Now, it's really important to understand that single women, and that includes widows, have exactly the same economic and legal autonomy as men. It's only wives who come under the umbrella of the common law doctrine of coverture. But the problem that the widows faced was, rather than perhaps in the Middle Ages, where they would receive a chunk of their husband's land when he died as a sort of pension provision, by the time you get to the 18th century, women are entitled to income, probably from shares, sometimes land rental income, but not the land itself, and that this provision would stop if they remarried. Now, the calculation for how much jointure you would get was done on the basis of the portion that you originally brought to the marriage. So women potentially, if they were to remarry, would have nothing to then take in to their second marriage, which might be one of the reasons why the marriage rate actually drops off for widows in the 18th century. And instead, people are looking to marry young women who have that portion, who've got access to that money.
So can actually bring that money into the marriage. I think we talked before we came on camera about another element of sort of the pressure that women face in the marriage market, which is simply that there were more women than there were men at the time, and there's been a lot of different reasons cited for this, but no one's actually kind of given a definitive.
I haven't been able to find a definitive answer that I'm satisfied with. People say that there were simply more women, there were more girls being born. That's a possibility. The Napoleonic Wars is another option, and that women during the period faced the sort of man shortage that affected the generation of women who came of age immediately after World War One. But I haven't been convinced by the figures on either of those. But whatever the reason was, the marriage market existed. It was an actual market, and it was intensely competitive. Intensely
competitive. And I think to sort of understand a little bit more why it was so competitive, we should talk about what life was like for single women. So, as you said, there were some cases in which single women actually could almost be better off if you had more of your own kind of personal income from your family, if you're not giving this over to men. So if we think about figures like Emma from Austen's novel, she's actually very well off in her own right, and she doesn't have any pressure to marry herself. But for the majority of women, that's really not the case. They're not going to have enough income to survive on their own.
So one of the options that women had was to perhaps come together in a household with other women, and to effectively work as a cooperative to pool their resources. And this is what the Austen women had to do when the Reverend George Austen died and they could no longer afford to live in Bath.
There's a really fantastic book on this actually that's called Single Women in the European Past. So it looks at single women from all over Europe in the early modern world. And there are a few essays in that basically explore how women work together as a cooperative, and proportionally how common this was, and it's more common than we think it might be in terms of our cultural understanding, and also the reasons behind why that came about.
Yes, and if anybody's interested in reading a fictional interpretation of this, I would like to recommend Sarah Scott's novel Millennium Hall, which sees a group of women come together, take over a stately home, and effectively build a kind of commune where they not only look after themselves, but they educate other women and bring other women and other sort of deserving children and people who are perhaps marginalised by society, and they bring them within the umbrella of their community.
I think within this as well, we need to think about how spinsters were thought of at the time. So the classic spinster in Austen's novels is, of course, Miss Bates, who's a figure that's quite ridiculous and seen as not particularly desirable. And this actually is quite a common trend towards the end of the long 18th century, that old maids were seen as a figure of ridicule and seen as like a very, very negative thing to be, which was all part of the kind of cultural pressure for women to want to marry, and seen as women that could make a good match, being the best kind of women. And so the antithesis of this is a spinster who's unable to make a good marriage, and so then she is the figure of ridicule. She is the absolute what you don't want to be.
And in the comments, it's been quite interesting, because there does seem to have been a feeling from you all that it's not quite shocking, but it's difficult to reconcile the image of Jane Austen with that of Miss Bates, because Jane Austen, the person, seems such a different personality type to Miss Bates.
And she absolutely is.
She absolutely is, obviously.
Austen has a lot more of the intelligence and sort of like intellectual rigour that Miss Bates lacks. But in terms of like their physical, financial life, she's maybe not a million miles away from the way Miss Bates was living, as a kind of genteel poverty. And Austen was very much helped by the fact that her brother obviously let them live at Chawton Cottage.
And the cottage in Chawton, and Miss Bates didn't have access to any sort of family support in that way. But it's definitely a cultural comment on Austen's part, not only to this, as Amy said, this caricature almost of old maids, which is becoming more and more prevalent in the novels, but it undercuts that caricature and sort of gives the economic and social reality, which is something that Austen herself could connect with.
Absolutely. Right, should we move on to our next topic?
Let's move on. And the biography section, and also Amy's new section that she's written, the celebrity section, has been garnering an awful lot of comments and interest. And really the biography section I find particularly interesting, because we've actually got into a discussion there of what constitutes the text of a biography. How does the biographer sit down and approach the task of writing a biography?
Absolutely. And there have been a lot of comments actually about the kind of actual physical constraints upon a biographer of source material. If the source material is not there, your biography is going to be limited and biased by the lack of source material that's available. So with Austen, we have, of course, lots of the letters that were destroyed, and we don't have any kind of personal diary, so any extrapolation of her internal life is very much based upon the letters and what we can glean from external sources, as opposed to her own inner monologue, which will limit what a biography can look like. And also in the discussions kind of tied to this is this notion of an agenda, and why a biographer might write about an individual, and how that might colour and shape the way that the biography looks.
Yes, and we were particularly concerned with the idea of truth. And is it the biographer's job to provide a true picture? If it is, what does truth actually mean? And is not part of the biographer's job to construct a narrative, to construct a story, and by doing that, are they not necessarily going to emphasise some things over others, just to get the narrative progress, to the narrative arc that they need to tell their story?
And in order to make it an entertaining read, and get across the sense of character, and I think a sense of character comes across more clearly in a narrative arc, as you say, than necessarily it would do with a lot of sort of like more dryly presented documents.
Yeah, and whether or not actually writing biography, you are using a lot of the same skills and a lot of the same techniques and structures that you would for writing fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to go back to that idea of truth, again, it links very much with celebrity, actually. So in celebrity, when a figure's become established, a lot of the desire and the drive that encourages an audience to buy materials associating to celebrity figure is this pursuit of the truth. So it's this pursuit of feeling like you will know the true character. And we see it in the way that I think Austen's biography by Paula Byrne, it's literally called the real Jane Austen.
Yes, that's right.
So you very, very clearly have this sense that this biography is aiming to get at the pure truth, and this is the real character. which again is a real kind of driver of what makes us interested and sort of like keeps us wanting to buy more and keeps us wanting to read more.
Absolutely. And finally, the final topic that we wanted to highlight was the idea of Shakespeare. And everybody's had a lot of fun. And I think so far we're up to 5 Shakespeare plays. We've had somebody linking The Tempest, particularly in regard to Henry Tilney and Northanger Abbey. We've got Twelfth Night. We've got an interpretation of the Mansfield Park reading exercise as being like A Midsummer Night's Dream. We've got Pride and Prejudice as Much Ado About Nothing. And today Teresa made a lovely comment in that the extract from Emma in the Dirty Walk section of the course is very much reminiscent of John of Gaunt's speech in Richard II. So really, we would like to encourage you to join into this thread. It's been, in fact, it's not just one thread, it's now multiple threads all over the course.
And they are fantastic.
They are, because Austen was such a lover of theatre.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really strongly get this in the letters, that she attended a lot of theatrical productions. She's very aware of the actors of the day. She's very aware of like kind of playwrights and writers of the day. And she performed her own home theatricals and wrote her own adaptation of Sir Charles Grandison for a home theatrical.
Yeah, and the Shakespeare connection is also interesting because it's during the Romantic period that Shakespeare undergoes a transformation and he starts to become the bard, the kind of the poet for all time that we know him today. So maybe it's an awareness on Austen's part, maybe a subconscious awareness, but an awareness on Austen's part of this transformation that Shakespeare is undertaking that makes his stories perhaps resonate for her. I don't know, this is all speculation, but have a view and come and join the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
The final thing really that we'd like to say related to that is please do come and join in. There are debates for anybody. You can talk about detective novels, you can talk about Shakespeare.
Yeah, there's literally every single topic
you
that
can
you could
talk
possibly
about
imagine.
Textual analysis. There is so much going on.
And I would really encourage people to get involved in the threads because there have been an awful lot of comments that are all related to it, different comments that we've seen and are all part of the same conversation. And I'd really encourage people to actually be linking these to one another because I think everyone would really benefit from this joint kind of community conversation.
This is how we learn. This is how we learn, by taking on board somebody else's point of view and adapting our own point of view in response to that. So please do join in. The material, obviously, week 3 is available. Weeks 1 and 2 continue to be available. If you want to have unlimited access to the course, then there is obviously the upgrade if you would like to do that. But even without that, there will be a few weeks after the end of the course where you can still access the materials.
Yeah, absolutely, and people will still be joining in those discussions, so it will still be quite a live community.
Yeah. So we'd like to thank you for all the input that you've had on the course so far this week, and we look forward to even more next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Bye-bye.